appreciate all of you taking some time to talk about this topic, which quite frankly is not a new topic. There were people who protested textiles back in the early 19th century, you might recall. But it could barely be a more current topic, right? So, we see books such as our friends Eric Brynjolfsson and Andy McAfee writing The Second Machine Age. David Autor just presented a paper at the Fed Jackson Hole conference just last week. And then actually the Pew Research folks, an eminent research group, just recently released a poll that they interviewed a number of experts in technology, some of whom I believe are actually in the room. And the results were quite interesting. It was about 50-50. It was 48-52 as to whether or not robots and artificial intelligence would actually displace a significant number of jobs by 2025. So obviously, it's a very current topic.
I always like to start with this wonderful line from William Gibson, the science fiction writer. He said, "The future is here. It's just not evenly distributed yet." So, yes, there's all kinds of science fiction things that we can imagine in the future, but we can also just look around and see what is happening today and then just extrapolate forward.
So I actually think if you look at most of the automation, it comes down to man-machine combinations. And all productivity does mean that each person, when you have productivity increases, each person is doing more, and so therefore the unit of number of people to do this amount of work goes down, right? But that then creates resources for doing other work. I mean, the most simple one was the transformation from an agricultural economy, right? We used to have a huge percentage.
41%, I think, of employment, right?
Yeah, was making food, and now it's like under 2, right? And so, and then they say, well, what happens with those 40% of the population? Well, they go on to other jobs. Now, the reason why this topic is urgent is, well, okay, does the exponentiating, Moore's law change the rule or not? There's always painful dislocation. Can we make that pain a lot less? Can we make this time cycle shorter? I want to share an example. One of the things I learned from a recent trip to Shenzhen, because it's one of the most interesting manufacturing hubs. And one of the things I was stunned by in looking at the most advanced factory. We went to Huawei doing the manufacturing, and I was expecting, as kind of a Silicon Valley technologist, that it was kind of like a complete line of robots. Right, it was like the whole thing would be automated because that would obviously be the thing to do. Roughly about 60% of it was automated and 40% of it was still people. And it's all a question of choice. You say, well, is that just because low cost? No. These are actually high paid, high skilled jobs. And the answer is actually because in the future, it's adaptability is key. And people are more adaptable. So when they set up the machine line, and it's all machine, it's actually a huge amount of retooling to shift it from line 1 to line 2, whereas the people are much more easy to shift.
If you look at this idea that it's a combination of man and machine, and you look at some of the examples that have really kind of surprised us in just how they've taken off, like Uber, like the Apple Store. They are actually cases where the humans are are made more powerful by their this background, and that creates a better customer experience, which creates new demand. I think ultimately, we are going to be focused on making better experiences for consumers, and that will not necessarily be automatable. When we say we want to create jobs, it takes away agency. It's this notion that somebody has this thing, and I will hire you, and you will work for the man. That whole cultural, ideal, is an artifact. It's not written in stone.
I think the optimistic scenario is, as Tim was describing, is that we don't just have also a creation of new industries and new jobs, which is essentially kind of full-time salary work, but also have the creation of a lot of different economic opportunities where people can be micro-entrepreneurs, they can do all sorts of things, and that we can facilitate, because we're in a networked age, a faster ability to have that invention, to scale up and double down on the inventions that actually work, and therefore the notion of the kind of very painful dislocations, because the whole move from the agricultural age to the industrial age actually came with a super amount of pain too. The pessimistic scenario is, roughly speaking, if you begin to get a broad number of, essentially, we have a serious youth unemployment today problem, and so we have yet to have that be hitting there. And a large percentage of unemployed youth that don't view they have a future usually leads to some form of civil instability. And so, that civil instability can compound and could create reactions that then actually block out the optimistic future.
We're privileged to be joined by another set of eminent guests, including 4 eminent economists and 2 other thought leaders from our local communities.
We have a deep kind of risk-taking culture, a lot of institutions about how markets work, especially capital markets, and a lot of public policies that have supported job creation in America. My hope wavers a little bit if I add the adjective good jobs, and our panelists have already picked up on that, and I think that's a really important question. We see evidence, it's quite clear in the US in recent years, that we're not creating enough good jobs. And so it's a question of, do people have jobs, but people care a lot about their W-2s. What incomes are they earning? If you segment it by educational attainment, since 2000, 96.2% of the US workforce since 2000 are in educational cohorts whose total money earnings, inflation adjusted, have been falling, not rising. That includes even people with a 4-year college degree and non-professional advanced degrees. The only ones that have been rising are the PhDs on average, and then the professional degrees of the doctors, the lawyers, and the MBAs. So that's a little sobering if you think about it. We're going to create good jobs. And a big open question we'll probably talk about, and our panelists already rightly pointed to it, I think, is public policies.
So I am with Matt on this. I said when I heard the question that I didn't think the formulation was correct because we live in a market economy. Supply and demand ultimately determine the level of employment. So the number of jobs will be created, but the quality of jobs is a huge question, I think. What's happening with the technology, which is skill biased and labor saving, is it's eliminating middle income jobs. It is complementary to the high skills in this room. So we all have jobs, and the jobs are high income jobs because some smart people have to work with the technology. But there is a very large number of people who are being pushed down into lower income jobs. The second thing that's really important, it's been with us for a long time, is the growing gap between productivity and wages. And you can see that in the gap between the productivity, a measure of the bounty of brilliant machines, and how it's being distributed in terms of wages. If we had an inflation-adjusted, productivity-adjusted minimum wage today, it would be like $25. We would not be arguing about $10. Public policy is, if anything, moving backwards. It's certainly not moving forward at the level of the race. So the policymakers lose the race, and a lot of displaced workers, a lot of American families lose the race. And that is my concern. Let me end by saying that one thing I begin to think about, I think it's important for all of us to think about. So we're talking about machines. Machines displacing people. Machines changing the ways in which people work. Who owns the machines? Who should own the machines? Perhaps what we need to think about is the way in which the workers who are working with the machines are part owners of the machines.
So what we're going to see is automation. Right now, manufacturing is trickling back to the United States. It's not rushing back because of the infrastructure costs, because of the difficulty in retraining a workforce. Give it 5 or 7 years, and that trickle becomes a flood. Give it 15 years, and now we have the robots going out on strike saying, stop the 3D printers, they're taking our jobs away. Because everywhere you go, you're talking about decimation, decimation, decimation. We cannot retrain the workforce. But no one can answer the question. Without doubt, there are no jobs. Now, what are the solutions? We can discuss that.
Today, take any field, biotech, infotech, nanotech, energy, healthcare, education. Everyone right now is wide open to revolutionary transformational developments. The only limitation we have is our ability to exploit them. That's the only limitation we have. Maybe we're looking at the wrong symptoms as opposed to looking at the fundamentals, which is that we are not innovating at the speed of the economy. We are not adapting fast enough. But just about everything you can imagine can be automated. Most of the jobs, even in this room, eventually will be automated. So, what does that world look like? It's hard to know. But in the short term, the number of opportunities we have in America is unprecedented. One problem is education. The good news is, again, technology is beginning to create curricula that can transform education.
I was struck recently by learning that in one of our largest banks, the turnover rate for bank tellers is 50% a year. So being a bank teller now is no longer a sort of skilled job. It's no longer really a well-paid job. So we've had this change in technology. Obviously, we've put a lot of the intelligence into the IT system, so we don't need such skilled bank tellers, although if you ever go to inside the bank, I try not to, but if you ever go inside the bank, you sort of long for the days when the bank teller was more skilled. But anyway, the banks obviously have decided, as have Walmart and many, many other companies, that it's more cost effective to use workers that don't have much training, that probably don't have a lot of education, although I think training is the more important. But instead to build into the production system the productivity, and they're very good at that. But it does create a huge number of not very good jobs, together with a set of jobs, the conceptualizers, the people that can take advantage of the technology, that have high incomes. So this has obviously created a problem of inequality in our society. But also we're seeing that people who cannot get, or don't have the gumption to get, you can go both ways on this, a good job, are actually deciding not to work at all. So they're ending up unemployed, they're ending up on disability, they're ending up leaving the labor force. Maybe there's a way we can have a technological initiative that could think about how we could change or adapt. I mean, we're not gonna take the technology from this direction to that direction, to change the direction of technology so that it is more friendly, more complementary with the mass of workers that we have that are currently not benefiting from that technology. If workers that have been consigned to lousy jobs suddenly see new opportunities opening to them, then I think there's more motivation, and they are much more willing to seek out the skills.
The most rapidly growing category of jobs in this large stub of occupations that the Department of Labor records was other. That is to say, categories that were not big enough yet to warrant their own line. And then, of course, under other, they did have some nascent industries identified there, and the most rapidly growing category of jobs in the U.S. economy over the period covered was other. And what people forget is that when there are innovations that destroy jobs, and as I say, we've been doing that for at least 2 centuries, we starting in Britain, maybe 2.5 centuries, incomes are created for somebody else. And to close the logical circle, you have to ask what happens to those incomes. It's a very important part of the process. And the incomes may be spent, but if they're going to be spent, they have to be spent on something, and that something creates new jobs. We may not know what they are ahead of time, but that something creates jobs. And where the private market won't do it, and there are lots of mechanisms in the private market that contribute to creating new jobs, but where they don't create adequate new jobs, then we can do it through monetary and fiscal policy. That's how we close the logical loop.